This is very weird. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'm going to talk mostly about my writing practice. Several aspects of what I have prepared have already been discussed, but I guess we can repeat. Okay, I'm going to start with an excerpt from a moving image that I recently finished. This lecture also kind of takes from discussions and reflections that came up while making that work. She knew the script off by heart. First, she'd ask you to come closer. And then, well, actually this script was porous, and more like a dream, or something not entirely written yet. And it was unlike anything anyone could ever memorize. I, however, knew her every word. There were 5 on a central, circular, orange wooden stage. I could see her, although we shared an eye. We shared an eye we inhabited together. In fact, all 5 of us. We stretched eye out. I was the largest of eye now. Not the eye of one, but the dissonant eye, the eye of many. A 5-centimeter long pinky nail wound itself around the longest string on the base and pulled. First an almost silent saw. Then everything was soaked in orange. The stage broke. The wood splintered. There has been no warning. The 5 were sent tumbling. This time, screaming words. An ocean of vowels erupted that together could easily be mistaken for a business of flies. Then, for no apparent reason, they all burst out laughing. Their voices trembling, the ceiling trembling. Here is where the play happened. This here is where it all took place. Invisible and inaudible to the audience, everything was soaked in orange. Drenched in orange so thick, orange started dripping, slipping, pouring. Orange started to spill out their mouths. The orange glare lasts just for a split second and is unperceivable to some. For others, it extends to a lifetime. You wouldn't know, I said, outside, looking you in the eye. And I replied, didn't you know all vessels are porous, silly? I had some slides. Oh, it's tiny in there. Maybe you can get it up there as well. It's actually just one slide, but you know. Okay, my artistic practice finds its impetus often in my writing practice, then becoming image, sculpture, or moving image. I seek out a space where language offers an opening into the unstable and slippery. I'm thinking a lot about ways to write that convey lived experience and embodied knowledge, while positioning itself in opposition to a dominant order of legitimacy within a system. It should be a video, but okay. Okay, cool. Ooh. Otherwise, it's fine. I mean, it's literally a 10-second loop. It's fine. I'm thinking a lot about ways to write that convey lived experience and embodied knowledge while positioning itself in opposition to a dominant order of legitimacy within a system that centers whiteness in its organization, knowledge, and validity. This includes writing that refuses to explain an experience that stands outside of that said organization, and instead tends towards speaking through such a lens of being othered. Language is naturally always shaped by the culture of its speakers, which is to say, by the dominant culture of a particular location. It's continuously shaped by the culture's values, political climate, aspirations, and many more. I don't need to go too in-depth about the links between culture and language here, I don't think. But we can see like this happening, for example, within political speech, differing vernacular languages in the same language, accents, dialects, etc. This symbiosis between culture and language is reflected in aspects that include the range of named emotions and how sensibility to its time is reflected to its senses, to name some. It is against this backdrop that questions arise what it means to speak English, Spanish, French, German, whichever Western language, when its organization does not account for one's experience. What happens when your own language fails at making sense of your reality? I'm going to read an excerpt from Jacques Derrida's Monolingualism. Picture this. Ooh, what happened? Sorry, 1 second. Of course, technical problems right now. Sorry. Okay. Picture this. Imagine someone would cultivate the French language. What is called the French language. Someone whom the French language would cultivate, and who, as a French citizen, would be, moreover, a subject of French culture, as we say. Now suppose, for example, that one day this subject of French culture were to tell you in good French, I only have one language, it is not mine. Or rather, and better still, I'm monolingual. My monolingualism dwells, and I call it my dwelling. It feels like one to me. And I remain in it, and I inhabit it. It inhabits me. The monolingualism in which I draw my very breath is, for me, my element. Not a natural element, not the transparency of the ether, but an absolute habitat. It is impassable, indisputable. I cannot challenge it except by testifying to its omnipresence in me. Yet it will never be mine, this language, the only one I am thus destined to speak. As long as speech is possible for me, in life and in death. You see, never will this language be mine. And truth to tell, it never was. Frustrating as this might seem, it also offers us different possibilities to retain agency. And I think now we're going to return back to also what Cedric has conceptualized in the beginning around opacity and refusal particularly. It creates a space that evades the dominant organization of words and instead basks in the insufficient nature of language. I think a lot about the ongoing possibility, the ongoing and possibly growing movements towards social accountability and social justice for people oppressed by white supremacy across the West, and the relevance or the role of identity politics that is increasing across the West as well. With identity politics, I mean here mostly what relies on visibility and naming the different intersections or the different characters of identity as a way to almost speak to character. Undoubtedly, these shifts are urgent, overdue even, as they finally let voices of marginalized groups be heard and finally shed more light on existing, ongoing inequalities, and hopefully will provoke change in meaningful, sustainable, long-term ways. I'm mostly quite pessimistic about whether things will actually change in meaningful ways, though. The goal of any organization or system is to preserve itself. And so while things are changing at face value, it is also important to remain attentive towards how this organization or system succeeds in changing its face while remaining the same within, just because it's insidious. On that note, looking towards identity politics, I am particularly aware of its prerequisite that a person's identity is legible and neatly categorized in a way that makes sense within our current organization of society. Secondly, the instrumentalization of non-white, non-straight, non-cisgendered, disabled, non-Christian people in advertising, politics, and arts, builds on an approach that perceives representation as being indicative of a diverse, tolerant, and inclusive space, or of progressiveness. While we cannot deny the positive effects it can have to see yourself reflected in spaces you didn't know you had access to, it is important to stay attentive to the employment of this tool of representation. This is a bit of a detour outside of art, but I find it hard to separate between the different realms because everything influences each other, right? I'm thinking also about, particularly in the UK, the introduction of quota as a way to counter social injustices, which I find often harmful because it builds on the principle of inclusion, where you include people into a system that doesn't get changed. So essentially nothing changes, but you just include more people into a harmful environment. This means that, while everybody's identity has to remain very legible, we can build on this approach of representation and hypervisibility that doesn't come with protection. So, with these things in mind, unintelligibility is a political tool that has been also employed for decades within Black feminism, abolition movements, Black poetry, to name just a few. So it comes as a refusal to allow Blackness to become a commodity and to counter an urge to capture or to own Blackness within spaces. So there are many political acts within this, and not at least the refusal to remain within a culture's term of legibility. Maybe for lack of a better word, I refer to this stance of rejection within language as slippery. As this mode of language seeps through graspability. It exists in opposition to visibility and legibility. Its enactment of refusal simultaneously turns to stretch, morph, and twist language to forge new spaces. Thinking about the space of art within this, it brings me to think about how there's an opening for the imaginative, the looking differently, and to consider also how artworks are produced, how they come to be. So the wider context of the production of art, labor, the circumstances that provoke certain artistic practices, the circulation of work, and of course the market. What can the process of making art generate in a wider sense? And what can the artwork itself generate in a wider sense? I'm thinking particularly about archive building for the future, institution building, and at large world building through an abolitionist lens. This brings me to the figure of the trickster. The late British writer and critic Jean Fisher characterizes the trickster in a 2009 text, Tricksters, Troubadours, and Bartleby, as a political gesture, which is a tactic of apparent conformity while retaining some measure of self-empowerment, a means of working within the framework of power without fully subscribing to its truths. Therefore, the trickster becomes a trickster by refusing a dominant system within which they find themselves. The trickster emerges from the margins of such a system. They become a trickster as a reaction to a system built on a violence that they know intimately, both mentally and physically. They refuse assimilation of the dominant culture as a tool for liberation, nor as a mode of survival. In this response to such a system, the trickster's method of refusal does not consist in simply inverting the language and codes of that system in a binary approach. In Towards a Metaphysics of Shit, Fisher writes, if the terms of a given discourse are simply inverted, they remain conditioned by the privileged authority, and they are easily reincorporated back into it, enabling it even to redefine and extend its own boundaries. The trickster turns away from inversion and instead employs the codes of the dominant system to forge a space within the apparent conformity to retain some measure of self-empowerment, a means of working within the framework of power without fully subscribing to its truths. These areas of research inform my thinking about ways to inhabit a society that takes necropolitics as a cornerstone, and mainly explorations of the trickster through artistic and formal modes of refusal. This includes the notion of fugitivity and fabulation, insofar as truth doesn't always overlap with fact, and the reclamation of agency through refusal. So much of what I'm thinking about with refusal, the fugitive, and the slippery comes from thinking about a way to inhabit the world at the point at which things flee, to use Sarah Ahmed's words, and thinking about the space it creates. In some ways, it may reflect an experience or a lived reality, a liminal space that already exists elusively. This is then where the trickster lives, where all these elements come together to create a room that aims to shake up notions of legitimacy or illegitimacy, and where fabulation replaces hard fact to facilitate looking elsewhere. She knew the script off by heart. First, she'd ask you to come closer, and then, well, actually, this script was porous, and more like a dream, or something that was not quite written yet, and it was unlike anything anyone could ever memorize. I, however, knew her every word. There were 5 on a central circular orange wooden stage. I could see her, although we shared an eye. We shared an eye we inhabited together. In fact, all 5 of us. We stretched eye out, and I was the largest of eye now. Not the eye of one, but the dissonant eye. The eye of many. A 5-centimeter long pinky nail wound itself around the longest string on the base and pulled. First, an almost silent saw. Then everything was soaked in orange. The stage broke, the wood splintered. There has been no warning. The 5 were sent tumbling. This time screaming words. An ocean of vowels erupted that together could easily be mistaken for a business of flies. Then, for no apparent reason, they all burst out laughing. Their voices trembling, the ceiling trembling. Here is where the play happened. This here is where it all took place. Invisible and inaudible to the audience, everything was soaked in orange. Drenched in an orange so thick, orange started dripping, slipping, pouring. Orange started to spill out their mouths. The orange glare lasts just for a split second and is unperceivable to some. For others, it extends to a lifetime. You wouldn't know, I said, looking you in the eye. I replied, didn't you know all vessels are porous, silly? Thank you.
Yes, I think we have some extra time. Perdón, español.
Yeah, I raced through that, sorry.
Tenemos un poco de tiempo, so I think maybe this is a good moment to have you back again, Harry, and we can ask. And if anyone wants to ask questions either to Harry or Deborah, that would be lovely. And we have a couple of minutes left.
You.
So, oh, perdón. Anyone? No?
I have a question for Deborah if no one has a question for me. If I could ask you a question, I would love to ask you a question. I'm really taken by your use of the word widening, and you're talking about widening the frame or sort of widening the possibilities. It made me think of a book that this academic Daniel Martinez Hosang is just about to publish called A Wider Type of Freedom. And he's looking at political representation in the United States and its imperial extensions, and thinking about how this idea of inclusion is a kind of ruse. It's a kind of like a way of enclosing people within an imperial project. So he's arguing that we need a wider type of freedom than this kind of like neoliberal representational politics. And I think one of the ways in which there's a conversation we can have about how to widen the frame, how to stretch the possibilities of emancipation, liberation. And I think one of the ways in which that can happen is this project of abolition, which is another idea you brought up in your talk. Like abolition, I think, is a kind of widening. It's a widening of the horizon to think about the sunset.
Definitely.
In any case, I would just like to hear maybe you ruminate or consider what do you think abolition? What do you think the possibilities of abolition might be in a cultural context or an art context? Does it make sense to talk about abolition within the cultural sphere, given that this is kind of a discourse that comes out of like a specific, oftentimes a specific like call to abolish the police and prisons, and the art world both is like carceral and isn't, because it's different. Like so yeah, I just wonder if you could say more about what abolition looks like for you within the cultural context.
Yeah. As you mentioned, I think abolition has been mostly discussed within like the framework of police brutality in the States particularly. I'm thinking about abolition maybe within my work more in the context of the production of an artwork and futurity, like thinking about if you want to widen the frame or whichever term you want to use, to think about how we could move beyond this current moment, current very long ongoing moment. We have to already consider what a future could look like, and I guess that's the foundation of abolition, in thinking about what does it like. Police abolition being one step of that, but what would that look like if the police weren't there? What does it take of each one of us to do so that there is a need for the police to be there? And I guess that goes also within like the production of the artwork, where often we're very there's still this thing of the artist as a singular narrator of an artwork, and I think particularly within moving image projects where you work with lots of different people, it can be interesting to think about how to incorporate those different voices, particularly also in a medium like film that builds on representation and portrayal, and capturing essentially, and including different voices into making such a project, but also creating through widening, or the slippery that I mentioned, like creating that space where there isn't a need for explanation. I think all of these kind of play into my understanding of abolition. Gail Lewis, who is a UK sociologist, said in a presentation of hers that living as a black body or living as a queer body today is impossible, because the world doesn't allow it. So in order to exist, you already have to live in the future. And I guess then it's just like another step to carry that outwards as well. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about the kind of contradictions of being an impossible subject, and actually the possibilities that are generated out of that by very dint of having to therefore challenge, you know, live in other times, basically.
Yeah.
It's really rich.
If anyone else has any questions. Okay, so I think we can finish here maybe. Thank you both
Thank
of you
you.
for being here. And thank you all for being here for these talks.
Okay.
So that's it.
Thank you to Bear and Alberto for organizing these. You did an amazing job, and I think
Thank
it was
you
a really
so
wonderful
much.
experience.